Today we're going to build this Workbench / Outfeed Table / Assembly Table. And before we jump in, I figured I'd show you a couple features of the Workbench that make it most useful for me. So first and probably most obvious is the Rockler T-track system. And I think this is going to be a huge time saver, especially when I'm working on tasks where I need to repeatedly clamp things down or when I need to elevate things. So you'll probably see me using it a lot in future videos. Next is just how much extra storage this thing's going to give me. Plus, I really like this push to open drawer hardware that eliminates the need for drawer pulls. And last is this flat wall on this side and this cubby on the other side. Now, technically I could have used these spots for more drawers, but I have enough already, so my plan is to put all of my table saw accessories over here and then make a pull-out cart that can park in this cubby. But that'll be a little bit down the line. Anyhow, this is a really big project, so let's stop wasting time and start building. So this project actually started off in my garage where I broke all of my sheets down into smaller pieces. And this was mostly so that I'd be able to carry them. In total for this project, I'm going to be using 5 sheets of 3/4 inch Baltic birch plywood, 2 sheets of 1/2 inch plywood, and 1 sheet of 1/4 inch. And there should be enough left over of the 3/4 and 1/2 inch material that I can use them on some other projects. And I should also say that this project is pretty much a modified version of what my buddy Johnny Brook built over on his channel, Crafted Workshop. And he actually has plans for this project, so I'm going to link those in the description if you want to take a look. And I'll throw a link to his video as well. Alright, so in the workshop, I could start breaking my pieces down to their actual finished dimensions. And in doing this, I realized a sort of irony. And that is, the hardest part about building this workbench is not having a workbench. It just makes for a lot of situations where you have pieces all over the ground, and, well, let's just say that not having it while I worked made me more and more excited about eventually getting it done so that I could start using it. It's also sort of hard to explain exactly what I'm doing in these shots, so let's cut to an animation that shows how all the cabinet pieces are going to come together. So the first thing that I'll mention, and this is probably the biggest tip for whenever you're cutting out a lot of pieces and you want a clean assembly, is this. Try to plan it out in a way where you adjust your table saw fence the fewest times possible. For example, see how I have a bunch of pieces that need to be 32 1/8 inches wide? Well, if I can plan it out so that when I'm ready to cut dimensions onto these pieces, I don't have to adjust in between for anything else, then I'm going to get perfectly consistent panels. Okay, so here I'm going to bring in some color to the drawing, and that way you can see which pieces are identical. If they're the same color, then they're the same dimension. So the base is going to have a series of these sides and vertical partitions. These are all those 32 1/8 inch tall pieces I previously mentioned. These can all be cut to their finished size prior to the assembly, except for these 2 pieces. My recommendation for those would be to cut their height, but wait on their length until just before you attach them, so that you can take a relative measurement. You'll see what I'm talking about in a minute. Anyhow, to that we add these 3 bottom panels, and then finally a series of 3-inch wide stretcher pieces for the tops. Now, you might notice that the design is a little bit odd, and that's because I wanted to make it where I could easily detach the entire back section. So if I ever need to move the workbench or anything like that, it'll just make it a lot easier. Anyhow, so this is a lot of breaking down material here, and I know it's not the most visually compelling thing in the world, but this is the last thing that I wanted to show you before we start assembling. And that's this little layout that you see me doing in this shot here. So this represents what you see in the drawing here. And by using that to determine the length of the long panel that runs down the center of my table, I'll get a much more accurate piece than I would by simply going off what the dimensions are supposed to be in theory. And to actually cut this piece to length, it was a little bit too long for my table saw, so I used my track saw. Next, I drilled a bunch of, well, I guess pockets for pocket screws. Here you can see me measuring and marking where I'm going to drill them, which is probably overkill. Really, the only thing that you want to pay attention to is making sure that the 2 panels next to each other don't end up with screws in the same locations that might run into each other. And a little pro tip, if you want to make pocket holing more exciting on camera, go with a combination of slow motion and no dust collection. Next, I could start assembling all of my cabinets. And if you've done all the prep work right, this part goes really fast. You'll go from what looked like a bunch of pieces to pretty much your finished shape in a matter of minutes. And the only real tip here is clamping. Just utilize any clamps that you have in your arsenal to help you keep everything locked down while you screw it together. For me, specialty clamps like these Rockler corner clamp jigs came in super handy. And even though I couldn't use them at every intersection, I think they went a long way in helping me to ensure that all of my boxes came out nice and square. The other thing worth mentioning here is that I didn't use any glue. And that's partially because I don't think that it needed it, and again because if I ever wanted to take it apart, I wanted it to be able to come apart easily. Next, I needed to make a bunch of drawer boxes. Initially, I'd thought to put 5 drawers in each cubby for a total of 15 drawers. But between this and the HiKOKI Workbench that I have, I just shouldn't really need that much small storage. So instead I made each of the bottom drawers twice as deep, and hopefully I'll be able to utilize those for some larger items. But I still really liked the aesthetic of the 5 even-sized drawers, so for the bottom one, I'm going to put 2 small faces on the drawer box to keep the same look. So the crucial measurement for these is the width, the part that'll go between the hardware sides. Mine called for a 1/2 inch clearance on each side, which I tried to nail exactly, and that ended up causing some issues for me, as you'll see in a little bit. So moving forward, I'm going to make my drawer boxes about a 1/16 of an inch narrower than I think that they should be. From my experience, it seems like most hardware is forgiving if you're a little bit too small, but not if you're a little bit too wide. Next, I could work on installing my boxes. So here I'm using a piece of scrap to mark out where the gaps between my drawer faces will be, and where my hardware will go. And honestly, this is probably unnecessary, but it's just kind of a moment for me to keep my hands busy while I'm sorting everything out in my head. So I don't even know why I filmed it. But in any case, I guess it's good because it illustrates how my hardware needs to be offset on the 2 boxes that are next to one another. That way the screws don't intersect. Okay, so here I'm marking out where my hardware is going to go, and this is important to mark, but only on one box, not on all of them. So once I have it laid out, I centered my hardware on the line and struck another line along the bottom of the hardware. And I could use that line to cut a piece of scrap plywood that I'm going to clamp to the inside of the box, and that I'll let the hardware rest on top of while I install it. So basically I'm starting with my upper hardware, cutting the piece, moving down, cutting the piece, moving down, and so on until all the hardware's in. Once all the hardware was in, I inserted all of my boxes, and everything worked out great on the 3 upper drawers, but my bottom drawers didn't work on any of the 3 cabinets. So I did a bunch of troubleshooting, sort of in real time on Instagram, so if you're following me there, you probably saw it. And what ended up working was removing a small bit of material using a router, just where the hardware goes. And that gave it just enough wiggle room to slide freely. With that done, I could cut out all of my drawer faces and attach those. And since I didn't mention it before, the reason that I went with this hardware is that I wanted a really clean drawer face with no pulls. So if you want to try these too, the brand is called Centerline, and actually I'll link them below too. Okay, now let's turn our attention to the top, which I know looks like it's already done according to this shot, but just pretend you didn't see that. So after I got all my pieces in, I cut one to the exact size that it needed to be. And this was a tip that I got directly from Johnny Brook. And then I cut the other one so that it was about 1/4 of an inch bigger in each direction than it needed to be. And that way, after I glue them together and it's all dried up, I can use a flush trim bit in my router to make both pieces the exact same size. And this was a nice little warm-up to using the router because installing all the T-Track required quite a bit of it. So I messed around with my SketchUp file for a bit and ultimately landed on this layout. And this wound up being about 34 linear feet of T-Track. And given that I tended to cut my full depth in about 4 or 5 passes, I added it all up, and it turns out I routed the equivalent of 3 5Ks. I think. I'm not good at math. Thankfully, it was all pretty easy though. I used a 3/4 inch bit, which was the perfect size, and set the depth to just a tiny little sliver, like we're talking an ant's whisker, deeper than what the track is, so that the wood top is just slightly proud of the T-Track. I didn't want to try to get it exact because I figured having it slightly recessed would be fine, but if it was slightly proud anywhere, that would cause problems. So for the actual T-Track, you can buy it in a few different lengths, and you can also buy these intersection kits that you see me installing here. And I know you're probably saying right now, why don't you just cut the intersections on your own? And you could definitely do that. And in fact, if you really wanted to get involved, you can actually make your own aluminum T-Track. So let's quickly walk through that. Okay, so first you're going to want to mine an ore called bauxite. And this can be converted into aluminum using the Bayer process. So to do that, the bauxite is blended for uniform composition and then it's ground. So this resulting slurry is mixed with a hot solution of sodium hydroxide, and then the mixture is... just go buy it. So after all the intersections were in place, I started cutting and installing the straight tracks, and you can just use a miter saw for this. The only real tip that I have here is get yourself one of these self-centering bits. They make the install a lot cleaner, plus they're good for installing all sorts of other hardware, so it's nice to just have one around. Alright, we're on the home stretch here. The next thing to do was plug a few pocket screw holes that were left visible. So I got a plug cutter and used it on a piece of maple that I had sitting around. And in total, I only had to fill 9 pockets, which I think is pretty good when you consider I probably cut like 200 for this project. Next, I decided to paint a colorful stripe on each of the front faces on one of the front columns of drawers. And I'll admit that most of my reason for doing this was looks, but I think that it could have some function too. First, I think it might make me more quickly remember in which drawer I've put things. And it gives me a good way to explain to somebody else where something is. Like, you're looking for a screwdriver? Red drawer. 18 gauge nails? Right of yellow. Tape measure? Around the corner from blue. If you're wondering what these stripes are for, those are to cover up a mistake where I cut a piece too short. Sometimes it's easier to hide a mistake by drawing attention to it, rather than covering it up. Anyhow, so the last thing to do was slap on a couple coats of Simple Finish, and that was it. Alright, so I'm super happy to have this project finished, partially because it was a lot of repetitive tasks, and it took me a lot longer than I thought it was going to take me, but mostly because having this workbench is just going to make the shop a lot more functional. I also want to thank Rockler for partnering with me on this project. I used a lot of their tools on this one, so I'm going to link them all in the description below so that you can check them out. And finally, I want to thank you guys for watching, liking, subscribing, and sharing these videos with your friends. That's how this channel grows, so it means the world to me. And I'd like to give an extra special thanks to a couple of new Patreon members. Mark Karen, Havard Ole Kopperstad, apologies for the name butchering, Ben Hawley, that's an easy one, and Josh Miyagi, which I feel about 80% certain I pronounced correctly. But I'll tell you what I feel 100% about, and that's that I could not be making these videos if it weren't for all of you. So thank you for everything that you've given me. For reals. And if you want to check out the Patreon link in the description to see if it's right for you, have a look. And as always, No pressure. All right, see you in the next one.